You said that the catastrophe that enveloped the people around your father was a consequence of lying. See, that isn't something that everybody knows, right? Because people think, well, the really naive people think that if you see a dictatorship, you have a dictator and his henchmen, and they're oppressing a whole mass of freedom-loving people. And if you just take out the dictator, well, then democracy will bloom. What they don't understand is that, what would you say? The dictator is just the biggest devil in hell. And in a really totalitarian state, every single person is lying about absolutely everything they say and do all the time to themselves and everyone. And the totalitarian state is actually the grip of the lie. The dictator is just he's the face of the lie. That's all.
Correct.
But every time someone in that totalitarian state lies, they're participating in their own demise. Solzhenitsyn detailed out, I thought this was so remarkable, that there were nowhere near enough committed communists to run the gulags. The prisoners had to run them.
Mm-hmm.
Right. There's a totalitarian state for you. It's an inmate-run prison, and the prison is lies. Right. So why did you know that?
That is a great question. I found it more difficult to live with lies than anything else. Nothing else mattered.
Why?
But speaking the truth. I think living in lies sucks your soul, sucks your energy. You're depressed. You can't wake up you wake up, but you don't really want to get out of bed. There's no reason. There's nothing to do. For me, living in lies, I might as well be dead.
No, it's worse. It's worse than death. That's hell, eh? Hell is worse than death. Right. That's a hard thing to understand.
I had to.
But I'm very curious about why you knew this. It's very telling, because that makes your willingness to seek opportunity and your desire to be able to keep speaking, that explains why that's paramount. Now, the reason I'm making a case of that is because, well, I don't know how many physicians leapt to your side, but I've seen how many psychologists in Canada have leapt to mine, and it's basically zero, right? Zero is a very low number. And so even though what has been done to me, although not particularly successfully yet, could easily be done to psychologists, and they're all being compelled to lie in Canada, as are the physicians, but people won't speak up. So now you did, and you wanted to, and you put that before even your concern about what you were going to do economically after your jobs disappeared. Okay, so that's weird, right? And you tied it a bit to what had happened to your father, but I don't understand how you knew this.
I just can't imagine why you would want to live in a perpetual lie. I can't even think of anything harder.
Short-term gain.
Well, I will tell, maybe this will help you as a psychologist. Once a psychologist, always a psychologist. I was never particularly interested in things that were faddish. So, for example, I didn't care about fashion, which is something girls usually care deeply about, because I always knew it was just a form of peer pressure. Not saying it in even a negative way. I'm just saying I wasn't moved by it. It didn't influence me. So all of those things that made me different, doctor, lawyer, Holocaust daughter, curious, not susceptible to the whims of fashion. It never, and I also wasn't a person who lived very grandly. So would I be able to get by? I mean, my income was really good. My plans for myself when this happened, the reason I was working 2 ER jobs was I was going to work really hard for 2 years, then I was really going to back off. I was saving a lot of money. It's not like I'm immune to earning money. But all of that went by the wayside if I had to live in a lie. There's just it's not even a close call.
Right. I mean, right. No,
And I do, it's probably somewhat of my nature, but the nurture element, you can teach as a parent how dangerous it is to live in lies. I mean, it's true, my background was Jewish, but people think, Hitler just happened and it just happened. No. There were a lot of lies to support
like
people.
Hundreds of thousands of them.
Yeah, but I remember, one that I remember as a little girl is a lot of scientists were back in Germany were measuring Jews' heads, and they determined they were different size and different shape than Aryan heads. And I remember saying to my dad, well, that's weird. Like, why didn't the scientists, they couldn't have found that because it's not true. And I remember thinking, that's so odd. I think I learned that when I was 10 years old. I'm like, well, that's so odd. Like, why didn't the scientists say anything? Like, were they just writing false numbers in their papers? Like, what were they doing that they allowed them to conclude that the circumference of the head was different amongst Aryans and Jews? And I remember thinking, that's hell. You're right, it is hell. It's not death. It is hell to live in a world where you can't speak. You know, the First Amendment exists not just so you can hear what I have to say, but humans have a need to speak truth. They have that need inside of them. So it's both
if they're not if they haven't corrupted their soul.
Right. But a baby growing up until you've, I mean, a North Korean child learns very quickly she can't speak. But if you grow up in relative freedom like we did in Canada and America, you have, I think, an inborn human need to speak and be heard. And all of a sudden, nobody was speaking truth. I know you didn't know hydroxychloroquine was safe, but if somebody said to you, water isn't wet, you would say, and that you had to say that, you'd be like, I'm not saying that. I'm like, that's what they said when they said hydroxychloroquine wasn't safe. They were telling me to say water's not wet. How am I supposed to say that and wake up every day?
Well, I felt the same way about Bill's. What do you mean have to? Exactly.
And then for me, mine was slightly different in the sense that mine was just like a specific fact that I knew that maybe not everybody knew, but all the doctors knew hydroxychloroquine was safe until media told them otherwise. So this nifty trick they did, they're safe and effective. So if the media and the journals had just said, oh, it's not effective.
Right.
Maybe I would have fallen for it. I don't think so, but maybe. But when they started saying it wasn't safe, when we've had it for 70 years, when there's a government database called FAERS, the FDA Adverse Events Reporting System, which keeps track of all side effects of drugs, and hydroxychloroquine is much safer than Tylenol in that database. They started saying it's not safe. I knew that this is a big lie, and I just knew that it's soul crushing. I didn't want to live with a lie.
Yeah. Okay. So now you're developing a career as a public speaker. Now you have some financial backing.
Yeah.
So you're a little more solid. What happens?
So we formed a formal nonprofit, and people started flooding me. I couldn't keep up. I had to start hiring people, but I had not enough money to hire people. I was having tons of volunteers, and then.
And this is happening over what span of time?
Oh my gosh.
Like months?
I'm telling you, instantly.
Yeah.
I spoke July 27th, I was fired. August, I spoke at Daystar. I'm saying by November, I had that foundational check of $170-something thousand. I didn't really have enough money. I had like one person work for me, 2 people, and I had a bunch of volunteers. And then they started coming out with the shots, and I knew my lane. Kicking and screaming was dragged into my lane, which is my lane was to stop mandates. I didn't even care so much about the average person who wanted to take medicine or didn't want to take medicine, or even the average person that wanted to take the shots or didn't want to take the shots. I cared about everyone being lied to, so they're making bad decisions. But I really cared about making sure mandates never became the law of the land, because mandates would have survived COVID. Mandates would have become show me your passport Jew. 100%, which they kind of did in some nations. Show me your vaccine passport. They did. And if I would go to my death stopping a passport, the social credit score system in America, or I will die trying. That was my mission. So I say that because everyone wanted me to provide hydroxychloroquine to the world. I mean, we got thousands and thousands of emails to my nonprofit asking how they can get the medicine. So for 2 years, that was the question. So at that moment, around December or November 21, I had to decide, would I go and find a way to give medicines to people, because I only have 4 hours in a day, or would I work to prevent mandates from becoming the law? And it wasn't even a question for me. This was my lane. It wasn't the medicine and the science. Whatever, how bad this was temporary. This was permanent. Are we losing our constitutional freedoms? So I went down this road, and starting in 21, I started bringing lawsuits against everybody, against mandates. And that was my mission.
Explain that.
Yes. So we they started bringing out the shots for kids. I was sued to stop that.
Sued who?
That specific lawsuit was probably the CDC. I've brought so many, it's hard to recall. That was our very first one in May of 21.
Yeah, and what possible justification
There's
was there
none.
for that?
I'm still bitter.
Well, one of the, part of the reason I presume that you were so terrified of the mandates, apart from the sociological effects that you described, is that enforced medical treatment, well, first of all, that violates the Geneva Convention in a major way, and for good reason. But it's worse than that, and we haven't seen this all play out yet. Like, typical people whose eyes are open no longer trust physicians
Yes.
or public health, that's a catastrophe. Because it means to the degree that that was a viable enterprise, which was quite substantive for quite a long time, that's all that trust has to be reestablished. And I suspect it probably won't be. So I have no idea what the consequence of that's going to be.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. So there's so much to say here. Public Health 101 says you don't inoculate in the middle of a respiratory pandemic. Public Health 101 never held that you inoculate everybody. It was always the high-risk group, and you let it kind of travel through the society, and the lower-risk group, like the kids, kind of spread it, and then grandma, maybe you inoculate grandma. Everything was thrown out the window. And so the trust should be lost from the public health because they completely sold out the public.
Right.
They completely sold out
Well, and
the
we
public.
don't even know how bad yet.
Oh, it's, I think trust in doctors went from 70 or 80% to 40%. And I think that that's completely appropriate. So in May of 21, they start saying that they want to bring the shots out to the kids. Now, this is horrific. Why? Because kids were not dying from SARS. In fact, by the CDC's own numbers, children...
Well, it still says on your Wikipedia page that you're spreading misinformation about the fact that children don't die from COVID. And yet they don't. And that's very well established.
Very well established.
What, it's as risky for a child as the typical cold, I presume. It's something, those are basically the numbers. And what, the average person who died from COVID had like 5 major comorbidities and was older than the average age
life
of
expectancy.
death.
So
Right, Jesus.
Right,
Brutal.
they had an average of 4 comorbidities, and it was like 77. Age of longevity was like 76.
Yeah.
It was criminal, and it was very criminal to do it to the kids. And we were
that was inexcusable.
why are they doing it to the kids? So that there's a whole financial motive, which is if you put it on the vaccine schedule, there's a lot of money involved, et cetera. But we fought that very hard. And I'm pretty proud because we brought that lawsuit in May of 21, and we had been told that they were probably going to release it right around May or June. So we worked really hard to get it out. And in fact, they didn't release the shots to the kids until a few months later. So I know we delayed it by a few months. Nonetheless, the moment they rolled it out, you asked why they did it. As soon as the shots were legally able to be given to kids, you then in America saw local jurisdictions that took the power from the parents and gave it to the kids. So if a kid wanted to get a shot, but the parents were awake and didn't want to get the shot, them to have the shot, the kid was able to get the shot themselves. I think the age was 14 in certain local jurisdictions. That became very clear that this was Marxism, which is to take away the parental rights and give them to the state. The state was subbing in for the parents. Now, that's never happened in America before. In America, the parent has a signed
So why
tuition
would you
slip.
leap to Marxism as an explanation for that? Because that's a big leap. I'm not disputing it, but it's a very
fascism,
big leap.
maybe not. I think of Marxism and fascism as the same. I would say that I was influenced a little bit by my father growing up in a communist nation. So in Russia... So in Russia, a child who went to school, they're 13 years old, might come home from school one day and tell their mom, oh, the dentist pulled 2 teeth today. In other words, the parent wasn't involved in the decision.
Well, and the kids there were invited to inform on their parents too. And it's part of classic Marxist doctrine that the familial structure should be decimated and that it's fine for, and the Russians made heroes of children who informed on their parents.
So how...
But to see that playing out in the United States and to attribute that...
Well, it's obvious. You asked me how I thought, because it only took 2 weeks. So in other words, the CDC said you could give it to 14-year-old kids, and then 2 weeks later, San Francisco and I think Baltimore, but there was a few jurisdictions that allowed 14-year-olds to do it.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, isn't that nifty?
Right.
Parents are expendable now.
Yeah.
That's why I said it's Marxist, because you're separating parents. That was
on the ground.
It was
obviously
obvious.
being prepared for moves like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that I felt that, and then I kept, even though we couldn't stop the shots, I was very hell-bent on stopping mandates. So we sued the Department of Defense, we sued UCLA, we sued on behalf of the COVID-recovered soldier, the COVID-recovered college kid. They were saying ludicrous things like natural immunity didn't work.
Yeah, right.
So we had these like really robust arguments. That's when I learned that judges were really just also quite incurious, and judges were very afraid, I think, to even look at what we were writing. I know that because one of our best lawsuits...
Well, they're not accustomed to having to adjudicate disputes between, like, profound disputes between credible physicians, right? I mean, you can't expect judges to be able... You know what I mean? The judgments are going to stay intact as long as the physicians are basically playing a straight game. And all of a sudden now everything's thrown up in the air. You can't even trust the damn journals.
But from a status quo perspective, a judge's natural tendency is to keep the status quo.
Yes. Well,
right?
Depends on the judge.
Well,
right?
no, but
Depends
I'm saying
on how progressive they are.
Or in medicine, it's to be risk averse.
Yeah.
Most doctors were
Do no
telling
harm.
And they were telling pregnant women, you know, don't take a bite of sushi, don't have a smoke, don't drink a glass of wine.
Right.
But all of a sudden, roll up your sleeves and take the new stuff. I'd never seen that in my career. You didn't have doctors saying that. It was bizarre. I thought it was like, you know, Invasion of the Body Snatchers. It made no sense. It was completely the opposite of how doctors usually acted. And then when we went to judges and we said, judges, look at these. We've got these world-class experts saying, whoa, halt. They were just not doing their job, in my opinion, and said they couldn't decide, they couldn't figure it out, so they deferred to the executive branch agencies. This is all relevant to being a doctor and a lawyer, because last summer, the Supreme Court has pulled away from the executive branch agency deferrals that judges acquiesced to. There was a very important case called In Loper Bright, where the Supreme Court reversed 40 or 50 years of judges just deferring to the executive branch agencies. It wasn't the NIH or the CDC, but other executive branch agencies. Judges had been given permission in their mind. Oh, you know, the executive branch agency, unelected bureaucrat, said to do this. I'm just going to do that. Well, that's what we were coming up against in COVID. We were asking the judges, in retrospect, here's these world-class, amazing physicians saying, whoa, halt. But over here's the NIH and the CDC saying, give it.
Yeah.
And the judges were just deferring to the agencies. Okay, but we have some hope in America, because a few months ago, in June of 24, in Loper Bright Enterprises, the Supreme Court held that judges were giving too much deference to executive branch agencies, and that's unconstitutional, and they have to adjudicate fairly. They can't just say the unelected bureaucrats are correct. They can't pass the buck. It's a very important legal decision.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Do you think that will have an effect?
I think it will change the landscape slowly going forward. I didn't understand that so much legally when I was bringing the lawsuits in 21 and 22, that part of the reason judges were so reluctant to believe independent physicians is that the judges had been trained, lulled into thinking their job was to just go with what the executive branch agency said. That was ripped up.
Well, that'd be convenient if it was possible.
Exactly. But that's not our system. The judges are supposed to be independent. So that actually, it was called the Chevron Doctrine, and it was thrown out. And thank God it's been 50 years and it's been thrown out. So going forward, bringing lawsuits, the judges can no longer hide behind the FDA said this, or for example, the EPA said that, right?
So that'll have effect there too, Environmental Protection
Any agency, the judge has to adjudicate looking at the evidence, not just give,
well, that's
Supreme Court said
for the new
it was
administration.
well-timed. Undue deference. He said they were giving undue deference.